I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to go camping again. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I wanted to bury what happened years ago. My therapist said facing the memories might bring some kind of closure, but all I've found is that old ghosts don't lie still just because you ask them to. They lurk in your mind, waiting for you to stumble upon them in the dark when you least expect it. Maybe it sounds dramatic, but I don't talk about that night often. The story's been told so many times by others, the news, the cops, even some of our friends. But none of them were there. Not the way I was. Not the way we all were. And the truth is, I'm not even sure I know what really happened. I remember glimpses, but details slip through my fingers. Pieces don't quite line up. I'll wake up some nights drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Flashes of faces and broken sounds pounding through my skull. But I can never put it all together. And now every time I'm out in the woods, even for a day hike, there's this whisper at the back of my mind, this sense that I'm being watched, or maybe followed. But I guess it's best to start from the beginning. The idea to go camping came from Lucas. He was the one who seemed to live for the outdoors, always pushing for the next big adventure. The rest of us followed him around like moths to a flame, maybe because he seemed like he knew how to handle anything. He'd been talking up some hidden spot deep in the woods, somewhere tourists wouldn't find, a place off the trails, surrounded by nothing but dense forest and absolute silence. Pure, untouched wilderness, he called it, eyes glinting with excitement. We met up early one Saturday morning, piling our gear into the back of Lucas's old Jeep. There were 4 of us that day, Lucas, Sam, Ethan, and me. It was late October, and even though the sun was still warm, there was a chill in the air. I remember noticing it more than usual, a brisk bite, like the air was warning us of the coldness to come, or maybe trying to tell us to turn back. But no one else seemed to notice. The drive felt longer than it should have. The road narrowed as we went deeper into the forest, trees crowding in, leaning toward the road like they wanted to reach out and stop us. The sun slipped behind a veil of clouds, and the leaves whispered as the wind picked up, a hollow kind of sound that settled uneasily in my stomach. But I didn't say anything. I wanted this trip to go well, especially after what happened last time. Lucas finally pulled over in a clearing, and we unloaded the gear, each of us stretching and inhaling the thick scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. "This is it," he said, waving an arm toward a faint path that wound deeper into the woods. The place looked like it hadn't seen a human in ages, and something about it set me on edge, but I forced myself to ignore it. We started the hike, following Lucas single file through the underbrush, the crunch of leaves and snapping twigs filling the silence. It was strange. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on us, judging us, or maybe waiting. After an hour, we found a spot near a cluster of tall pines. There was something unsettling about them. They towered high and close together, creating an almost impenetrable darkness beneath their branches. Lucas seemed pleased with the spot, though. "This'll be perfect," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Nice and secluded." I forced a nod, but I could feel something creeping up my back, a gnawing feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. We split up to get everything ready. Sam and Ethan went to gather firewood, while Lucas and I pitched the tents. I could hear Sam and Ethan laughing somewhere in the distance, but their voices echoed strangely, bouncing off the trees in a way that made them sound warped, distorted. I kept glancing around, my skin prickling with each sound that didn't belong. "Man, you look like you've seen a ghost," Lucas laughed, snapping me out of it. I shrugged it off, not wanting to admit the strange anxiety clawing at my chest. He wouldn't understand. He never did. To him, everything was an adventure, something to conquer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hidden somewhere in the shadowy spaces between the trees. Night fell quickly. The sky darkened to a bruised purple, then faded to black, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. We built a fire and huddled around it, each of us leaning into the warmth as the temperature dropped. Sam and Ethan started telling ghost stories, each tale more gruesome than the last. But no matter how ridiculous they got, something about the atmosphere made it hard to laugh them off. Each time the wind howled or a branch snapped in the darkness, I felt myself jump. At one point, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, grabbing a flashlight and stepping just beyond the firelight. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating patches of ground and twisted roots. I remember staring into the shadows, feeling as if there was something just out of sight, something waiting, holding its breath. My own breathing grew loud in my ears, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see a shadow flicker or hear footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. I thought about going back to the others, but I didn't want them to think I was afraid. So I held my ground, but every second felt heavier, as if the darkness was closing in, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. I finally managed to convince myself it was all in my head and made my way back to the fire, but something was different. The others were sitting quietly, staring into the flames, their faces shadowed and tense. "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered, eyes wide and flicking toward the trees. I shook my head, but my heart was pounding. It wasn't like Sam to look scared. He was the one who usually cracked jokes, who could always find a way to laugh off anything. But right then, his face looked pale, haunted. I glanced at Lucas, expecting him to be his usual cocky self, but even he looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the trees like he was searching for something he didn't want to find. And that's when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was almost too quiet to notice, a soft rustling, as if someone, or something, was dragging its feet across the forest floor. I felt my skin go cold, every hair standing on end. But I didn't say a word. None of us did. The fire crackled, casting long, shifting shadows around the campsite. We sat huddled, staring into the flames as if they could somehow protect us from the thick darkness pressing in. I don't know how long we sat there in silence, each of us too afraid to break it, as if speaking might invite something closer. Eventually, Ethan cleared his throat, trying to force a grin. "All right, so which one of you jokers is trying to freak us out?" he asked, his voice light but with a tremor beneath it. Sam frowned. "What do you mean? None of us went anywhere." Ethan's face tightened, his eyes flicking from Sam to Lucas to me. "Come on, man. I'm not stupid. I saw someone, or something, moving out there. I thought one of you was messing with me. You know, sneaking off for a scare. I wanted to tell him I'd seen it too, or at least heard it. But something stopped me. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy, or maybe I was afraid that saying it aloud would make it real." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes locked on the fire, my fingers digging into the cold, damp earth. "Look," Lucas finally said, glancing around at all of us. "We're out in the middle of nowhere. It's probably just an animal or something." He shrugged, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just an animal. There was an unnatural stillness to the forest, a silence that seemed to deepen with every passing second, as if even the trees were holding their breath. And then, just when I thought the silence would swallow us whole, we heard it again. A faint, dragging sound, closer this time. We all froze, our eyes wide and locked onto the shadows beyond the firelight. The noise continued, soft and steady, like something heavy being pulled through the leaves. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel my hands start to tremble. It was closer now, just beyond the edge of the firelight, where the darkness grew thick and impenetrable. "All right," Sam whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Whoever's out there, you need to stop messing around." No answer, only that same dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something was circling us, waiting. Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating patches of bark, twisted roots, and piles of leaves. But there was nothing there, only the trees, standing silent and still, as if mocking our fear. Let's just go to bed," Lucas said, his voice strained. "We're all tired, and we're just freaking ourselves out. Tomorrow, this will all seem ridiculous." We nodded, eager to end the night, to escape the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. We scrambled into our tents, each of us zipping up tight, as if the thin layer of fabric could somehow protect us from whatever was out there. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, my mind racing and my heart pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I tried to close my eyes, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the silence was unbearable. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, sent my heart racing. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. It was closer this time, louder, like it was right outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, my breath shallow and ragged, my body tense and ready to bolt. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. And then, the soft, unmistakable sound of someone, or something, breathing. My blood ran cold, and I could feel every inch of my skin prickling with fear. It was right there, just on the other side of the thin tent wall, so close I could almost feel its presence pressing down on me. I clamped my hand over my mouth, afraid to make a sound, afraid that even the smallest movement would give me away. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. I lay there, motionless, for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the soft, gray light filtering through the tent. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, the memory of the night before hovering like a fog in my mind. I almost convinced myself it had all been a dream, a product of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, I saw that the others looked just as shaken as I felt. Lucas was staring off into the trees, his face pale and drawn. Sam was pacing, muttering to himself, while Ethan sat by the fire pit, his hands clenching and unclenching as he stared at the ground. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't say a word about the noises or the strange presence that had seemed to surround us. Instead, we moved in silence, packing up our things with a kind of frenzied urgency. We all wanted to leave, to get as far from that place as possible. But just as we were getting ready to go, Ethan froze, his eyes fixed on something near the edge of the campsite. "Guys," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Look." We turned, following his gaze, and my heart skipped a beat. There in the dirt just beyond the tents was a trail. A long, twisted drag mark, like something heavy had been pulled through the leaves, leading away from our camp and disappearing into the trees. We stared at it, each of us too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. My mind raced, replaying the sounds from the night before, the soft, dragging noise that had haunted us in the dark. I glanced at Lucas, expecting him to brush it off, but he looked just as terrified as the rest of us, his face pale, his hands trembling. Without a word, we grabbed our gear and started down the trail, moving as fast as we could, our footsteps loud and frantic in the still morning air. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us, something lurking just beyond the trees. But there was nothing, only the empty silence of the forest, watching us, waiting. The hike back to the Jeep felt like it took twice as long. None of us spoke, and every crack of a branch or a rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. By the time we finally reached the Jeep, we were all drenched in sweat, our faces pale, our bodies tense. But just as we loaded up the last of our gear, Sam paused, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the Jeep. I followed his gaze, my heart sinking as I saw what he was staring at. There, scratched into the bark of a nearby tree, was a single word: "Stay." A cold chill ran down my back, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced at the others, and I could see the same fear mirrored in their eyes. Without a word, we climbed into the Jeep, Lucas slamming his foot down on the gas as we tore down the dirt road, leaving that cursed place far behind. We never talked about it after that day, never mentioned the noises, the dragging sound, the breath on the other side of the tent. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it. The soft, steady drag of something moving through the darkness, coming closer, inch by inch. And every now and then, I find myself wondering if it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far from the beaten path to step into its territory and disturb its silence. Waiting, perhaps, for someone like me to make the mistake of coming back.